Good afternoon, everybody, and I hope everyone's enjoying their Friday afternoon. It's pretty lovely here in the Napa Valley. We had pretty much the whole week really bright sunshine, nice temperatures, which has been pretty good for us to, get the grapes excited again to start growing. We're a couple of weeks behind from where we normally are because of the cold weather that we had over the weeks before this one and the frost and whatnot. So we're looking forward to this weekend a little bit because we're going to get more rain, which is kind of exciting for us. We didn't necessarily have a really, really wet season, but a little bit of rain and a little bit more water in the soil is always good for us at this time frame. We don't have really much to worry about in terms of the vineyards because they're just now starting to grow. So not a lot of concern there. So if we get a little bit more water, it'll help us out for, the unknown of how hot the summer is going to be and what our water requirements could possibly be at that point. So anyway, that's a little bit about the weather here. And actually, we're expecting about an inch of rain over the weekend, which is kind of a lot, for this time of the year, April. But we'll see what happens. Anyway, let's talk about wine and drinking wine and tasting some wine. And I thank you guys all for joining me. Before I get too deep into the conversation about the wine, I want to tell you guys about a concert that we're doing tomorrow on this platform as well. And it's with a good friend of the winery. His name is Philip Claypool. He's a fantastic musician, longtime friend of the winery, and we're doing that across this platform. And you can check it out just by going to miranapa.com/concerts, and that'll kind of take you to the link for the show tomorrow afternoon. So let's talk about this wine. So this is the third wine that we're offering in our SIP as you SIP program, the Mira SIP as you SIP program. And as I mentioned before, we thought it was cute that the shelter in place, when you take the letters and abbreviate it, it's SIP. And so I know a lot of people have been sipping while they've been doing this. And most of us over here in California, Northern California, we've recently gotten orders that we're going to be sipping for a little while longer. So hopefully all this passes by and gives us a chance to taste some really good wine as we're waiting. So our SIP program, tell you a little bit about that for those of you that aren't aware of it. And you can find out more about it on our website. But it's basically, we're looking for a way that we could help our community. Similar to across the country, a lot of the restaurants are suffering and being shut down and whatnot. And we thought, how can we help out some of the people that are involved in the restaurants? And we decided to put together a program with the three wines that we produce the most of. And it's about 800 cases of wine that we're talking about of each of the three different varietals. And offer these at up to a 40% discount so that we can help people not only keep their sanity by hopefully drinking a little bit of wine at home, but also help us help our community by using some of the proceeds to help out some of these restaurants and the people at the restaurants, which have been really important for us here in the Napa Valley. So with that said, let's dive into this Cabernet Sauvignon. So this is a 2011 vintage Cabernet Sauvignon. And different about this wine compared to the last two that we've already tasted, the Chardonnay and the Pinot Noir. This one is actually a blend, and most of the stuff that we do at Mira Winery are single vineyard, single varietal wines. But on occasion, we have put out a couple of wines that are blends. And so this Napa Valley Cabernet, as we call it, because we produce a couple different Cabernets. We've got our flagship wine called the Schweitzer Vineyard Cabernet. That's single vineyard, single varietal, and I think at some point here in the near future we'll do a tasting on that wine. And we have a Cabernet from Yountville appellation as well. But this one, the 2011, and we had other vintages as well. It's more of a blend of I call it the greatest hits of the Napa Valley. So instead of being a single vineyard and single varietal Cabernet, this has Cabernet from as far north as the Rutherford appellation, which is pretty much the heart. If you guys saw the video that I did on Instagram this morning, I was kind of in the middle of that appellation and actually at the border of Yountville, Rutherford, and Oakville. So we go as far north as Rutherford for this wine. And from there we get Cabernet, and then we head south, and this vintage included a little bit of fruit from Stag's Leap. And we go a little bit further south, and we're basically at the eastern side of the Napa Valley, close to the limit of the Oak Knoll appellation, not too far from the Chardonnay vineyard that we tasted a couple days ago. It's not Oak Knoll, that's just Napa Valley. It's not in any particular appellation. And then on top of that, besides blending the different Cabernets from the different areas, there's also a little bit of Cabernet Franc and a little bit of Merlot, and both of those come from the Hyde Vineyard in Carneros. And so why is there a Cabernet Franc and why is there a Merlot? Well, what I usually say about Cabernet, as much as I love it, that it's not as perfect of a grape as Pinot Noir or some of the other single varietals that we have. So it needs a little bit more help from other varietals to give it that boost, to make it the compelling wine that we try to make it be. So similar to the Pinot Noir, the harvest for these wines is we harvest them overnight, of course, try to bring the fruit in as cold as possible. A selection happens, or a sorting happens at the winery at a sorting table before it goes into the destemmer to get destemmed, but not crushed. So similar to the Pinot Noir, it goes 100% whole berry into the tanks. And so all of these vineyards that I was talking about, I think it was 3 different Cabernet vineyards, maybe 4 from 2011. That was a while ago. I'm trying to remember. 4 Cabernet vineyards and the Cab Franc and the Merlot. Everything is kept separate throughout the entire process. And even during fermentation and after fermentation, and everything is kept separate through aging. This ages for 18 months in French oak barrels, 65% new. And everything is kept completely separate and works separately throughout the course of aging. And there's a reason for that, which I'll explain in a little bit. So we harvest at night, sorting, go into these different size tanks. We do different types of procedures for making the wine. So having the luxury of having a couple of different Cabernets to work with and a couple different tanks allows me to treat each tank a little bit differently and try to coax something out of the different fruit from the different areas. So, one tank I might ferment, if let's say it's Rutherford Cabernet Sauvignon from an older vineyard that's got just a lot of character, and I'm just going to ferment it really, really hot, 88, 90 degrees, which is kind of the limit for me, and try to extract as much as possible with a lot of cap management. And cap management is basically the process that we use to get as much as we can from the solid parts of the grapes into the juice. So there's a couple of techniques that we use in cap management that I'll go over, and this will be redundant for those of us that joined us on Pinot yesterday. Is basically there's 3 ways that I work the cap. So what is the cap? First of all, basically when we crush the fruit or destem the fruit in our case, and we fill the tanks, in the case of red wines, the entire grape goes into the tank. And yesterday I talked about using whole clusters on Pinot. On the Cabernet varietals, which are Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, Merlot, Petit Verdot, I don't use any whole clusters. I destem everything. And the reason for that is, Cabernet varietals on their own tend to be a little bit vegetal sometimes. And so sometimes the clusters themselves have this green character to them that I just don't want to transfer into the wine. So no whole clusters on the Cabernet. So we go into the tank. Everything's separate, as I mentioned. So we have different sizes. The different vineyards produce different amounts of fruit. So we have different sizes and whatnot. And from there, we determine how we're going to work the tank. So as I mentioned yesterday, there's basically 3 techniques that I use to extract flavor into the wine. So the grapes go into the tank. They sit there. We do a cold maceration, which is basically keeping the grapes and whatever juice is starting to juice on its own, because the weight of the grapes themselves start crushing the grapes and releasing the juice early on. And so, or, a little bit at a time. And so we want to keep that situation kind of going for at least 4 days for me, because I'm trying to get as much of the fruit character into the wine as I can before I start actively fermenting. So, and by the way, you guys, I like this to be interactive. So if you have any questions, I'm gonna, please type them in. I'm not looking at the screen for what's being typed as I'm speaking to not be distracted, but I will get to the questions at the end of the tasting, so that I'm happy to answer any questions. And hopefully you guys are all sipping on something, even if it's not the Mira Cabernet today. So I'm happy to talk about anything basically, because I love what I do. So anyway, back to and I have a lot to say. So back to the wine. Anyway, we'll be in the tank with cold maceration, and this is at 50 degrees, which is pretty cold. And that's where picking the fruit as cold as possible is really handy, because we don't have to chill things down and picking it early in the morning so that the grapes don't have a chance to warm up during the course of the day. So if the grapes already come in at 50 and that's kind of the temperature I'm looking for, I don't have to do a whole lot to chill the grapes down. So we'll sit in the tank for 4 days, maybe up to 10 days, depending on the vineyard, which is a pretty long time for cold maceration. And by that time, the fermentation kind of wants to go. So it's kind of the limit of what we can get away with for a cold maceration. So anyway, during this cold maceration period, some people decide to just leave the grapes in there and not do anything. I actually work the cap a lot during this period, because the juice starts separating, and I want to get the juice in contact with the solids, which becomes the cap eventually, to get as much flavor into the juice as early on as possible. And so basically, what's going on then is the grapes are basically crushing themselves on their own weight, releasing this juice. And I'm using these techniques that I keep talking about that I haven't described yet to get the flavor and the color into the juice. And one of the things I didn't mention yesterday is that most, like 95, 90, 98% of the grapes that are out there, even red grapes, the juice is clear. So when you squeeze the grape, there's no color in the juice. So we have to get the color from the skin of the grape into the wine. And we have to do that with these mechanical methods to extract it out and get it to go into the wine. And then different ways to maintain it in there and to make sure that it's as much as possible that's in there for me. And so anyway, it's being crushed on its own weight. And then I use these 3 different techniques, mostly varietal dependent, to get as much extraction or work the cap as much as I can. So basically there's three ways. And on Cabernets, I use 2 of these 3. And I'll go in the opposite order of what I did yesterday. The one that I use primarily on Pinot, it's called pigeage, or punching down. And that mainly involves having a tank with an opening on the top that allows you to plunge into the tank and push everything down into the juice. So as things start to ferment, once we get the fermentation going, the yeast is active, that cap, and this is really when it becomes a cap, all the solid grapes that are in there, because of the carbon dioxide being produced during the fermentation, those solid grapes start coming together in this cap, and they start floating to the top of the tank, and they'll stay up there. And so what we want to do is we want to get the liquid into contact with the cap, because that's where the color is and where most all of the flavor is. And so these techniques are designed to get the juice in contact with the cap. So the first technique that as I was describing, the punch down, is basically we stand on top of the tank with like a long plunger, stainless steel plunger that's got a disc on the bottom, and we just push the cap into the tank going around. And we'll do this several times a day depending on the flavors that we're getting. And it's a lot of hard work. If it's a 10-ton tank, we're not going to do a punch down because it's really not humanly possible to do so. That's a lot of cap that you have to push in there, and none of us at the winery are really that strong. So we limit that to tanks that are like 3, maybe 5 tons at the most to do that on. The second technique is the délestage, and I like to reserve that one more for Syrah, but I do use it on the other varietals. And basically what that involves is draining out all the liquid from the tank into another tank and leaving the cap on its own. So once it's fermenting, sometimes I decide I'm going to let the cap get really, really hot and just kind of like work itself. And by really hot, I'm talking about like 95 degrees, 97, which is basically the threshold of what yeast can really stand before they start dying because it's too hot in there, which some we try to avoid. So maybe I'll leave it in there for 20 minutes, even an hour, depending on what stage of the fermentation is in, before I return the liquid back into the tank. And so that's kind of where I decided to have a little bit of fun with it. There's no rules to tell you how to return the liquid to the tank. So sometimes I might return the liquid over the top of the tank. I might return it through the bottom valve, because there's 3 valves on our tank. So maybe the very bottom valve. Or I might just go back into the middle valve, which is the one that we mainly use when we're processing and working the juice. Return it all, and then that's our process. And it sounds really easy, but it's a really long process that it's pretty labor intensive to do. And then the third process, which is the one I typically use for Cabernets, and most people do, is the most basic one of all, is the pump over. And that basically involves exactly how it sounds. So we have the juice at the bottom, or the fermenting must, and that second valve from the bottom that I described, that we call the racking valve, we'll hook up a hose to a pump, and then that pump will circulate the liquid to the top of the tank. And then on the top of the tank, we typically will have an irrigator that will spread the liquid throughout the cap. And so as it's spreading it and wetting the cap in different areas, the liquid is kind of going through the cap and grabbing flavor as it's going. Sometimes, if it seems like we need to work it a little bit harder, we'll do what's called a fire hose pump over. And that sounds exactly like what it is. So one of us will stand at the top with the hose, and we'll just blast, with the pressure of the liquid coming out of the hose, just blast the different areas. Kind of like when we're doing a punch down, but this time we're using the force of the liquid that's coming out of the hose to push to blast through the cap and have the liquid come out a little bit more violently and grab more color and more flavors and stuff as it sifts or goes through the liquid. So we'll do that. The fermentation will last probably 10 days, and the difference between Cabernet and Pinot is that Cabernet doesn't want to ferment as fast as Pinot does. I mentioned yesterday, Pinot likes to go in about 24 hours if it can, and we try to hold it from doing that. Cabernet, we don't have to worry as much about because it diligently is a good soldier and will do its fermentation at a very moderate pace, gaining heat and reducing sugar over the course of 7 to 10 days. And so we really don't have to watch it that much in order to assure that the fermentation is going to go the way that we want. But during that time frame, we are tasting it often, several times a day, and making spot decisions on how we're going to extract into the wine. So these activities that I mentioned, the pump overs and the punch downs and the delistage, we'll taste them. We might do 4, we might do 5, we might do 6, we might do 2. It just depends on how we think the wine's progressing and what the feeling is of what we can get. Because of course, if it's not in there already in the grapes, we're not going to get it regardless of how hard we try with these different techniques. So it's a lot of work during this period. And for me, it's really important to be present during this period and taste the wine as much as possible, or the must, to ensure that I'm getting what I want and that I'm not getting things that I don't want, so that I don't have to go through later on and correct it. So the other thing too is in terms of tanks that I didn't mention yesterday is that we have a variety of tanks. Besides sizes, we have a couple materials that we work with. So I love using wood to ferment wine in, and also for aging, obviously, the French oak barrels. And so in addition to our normal stainless steel tanks, we have 3 French oak fermenters that hold 5 tons of grapes. And that's really important for me. And it's something that I'll describe a little bit more maybe when we taste the Schweitzer Cabernet, because I really like those tanks more for that fruit. But you get the benefits of using barrel much early on in the process when you ferment in these wood tanks. And so we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But it's important to have this variety of equipment when you're making the wine, because it gives you more complexity into the wine. So then after the 7 or 10 days of fermentation, we might be up to day 15, day 20 into the tank. And that's kind of how we keep track of things, is how long the juice has been in contact with the skin. So skin contact time is something that we talk about a lot. And on Cabernets, there's a much longer period after the fermentation's over that the liquid stays in contact with the solids. Once the fermentation's over, though, we don't touch it anymore. We just kind of let it sit. The cap will just kind of float on the top. At some point, the CO2 gas starts running out, so the cap starts falling, and that's when we start thinking about making some changes and moving the wine out of the tank. But otherwise, we'll just kind of let it sit, kind of let it, technically the word we use is macerate, and that's kind of what it's doing. And just taste it and see at what point we need to drain and press it. And what's the decision for us to drain and press is, are the flavors starting to get a little too bitter and aggressive, and we're losing maybe some of the fruitiness that we like, or are we picking up other characteristics that are kind of pumicey, and we don't want that into the wine. So at that point, we'll decide to move it out. So for Cabernet, that usually for me means from 35 to up to 40 or 50 days into the tank, which is a really, really long time. Just out of reference, some of the people that like to make really fruity wine, more fruit-driven wine, they like to drain and press when the fermentation, it still has 8% sugar to go. So they don't even finish the fermentation before they're pressing it out, because in that way they retain much more fruit character into the wine. I like the more traditional approach of using the different varietals to give me the different things that I want into the wine. So with the Cabernet, I'm looking for the structure and the fruit element, but it's got its own fruit element that's different than Merlot, that's different than Cabernet Franc. And maybe in Cabernet Franc, I'm using that not only for the flavors, but also for the aromatics that it brings into the wine. And then Merlot, it's more about the juiciness and the body and this fruitiness that I was talking about going into the wine. So, there's 5% Cabernet Franc and 5% Merlot in this wine. That might not seem like a lot, but when we're doing these blends, a little bit goes a long way with some of the varietals. So we have to be really careful when we're doing our blends and not just throw the whole kitchen sink in there and call it a day and say we're going to bottle that. We really spend a lot of time during the aging process, which for this wine is 18 months in barrels, evaluating the different lots and playing with blending. You see up here, I have different graduated cylinders that I use to try to make blends, and that little fish tank looking thing up there, I use that to blend into and just play with the different percents, not only of the other varietals that go into the wine, but also the Cabernets that are going into this wine. Because maybe one Cabernet might be too harsh, and so I don't want to use as much, and I'll use that for something else and things like that. So it's a very involved process, and it's a lot of work to get finally to the wine that's in the glass. So back up again, we drain and press after 35, 50 days, depending on the wine. Goes into French oak barrels, 65% of them new. And then we go through the secondary fermentation, which is the malolactic fermentation, which is the first time was a yeast converting sugar to alcohol on the primary fermentation. This time it's a bacteria that changes malic acid into the softer lactic acid that you find in milk. And so it gives you a little bit more creaminess and body in the wine rather than a more harsh tone that you might get from the malic acid that was originally present. And it's kind of cool because it's a natural process that happens, and it's a stabilization that happens in the wine on its own. So it's pretty neat. So that process can take up to a month, 6 weeks in the barrel. And then once that process is over, we top up the barrels, and then we call it pretty much a vintage and just kind of let it age for the next 17 months, 16 months, that we have to go. During the course of that time frame, though, we're tasting it, like I mentioned, and Cabernet is a varietal that needs a little bit more air because it's got a lot more structure. And so, whereas with the other wines, I try not to move them so much once they hit the barrel. This wine, I'm compelled to do so at least 2 times. One time in the middle of the 18-month time frame, and then another time, of course, to take it out to bottle. But some years, the wines show different things, and I have to move them a little bit more out of the barrels and then put them back in the barrels to continue the aging process. So, getting into this wine then, this is 2011. And 2011 was an atypical year for us in Napa. It's usually we don't really see any more rain here in Northern California. Once June hits, we might get like a small shower for 3 hours out of the day one day, and then nothing until basically late October or into November. And so what happened in 2011 is a pretty wet year, and the rains came a little bit sooner in the season for us. And so Cabernet, by circumstance of being the varietal that takes the longest, that has the longest cycle to ripen, was the last one on the vine. We'd already harvested all the other varietals, and Cabernet was still waiting for ideal maturity to happen, right? And we're waiting for flavors and things like that. And the interesting thing was that even though the sugar was accumulating, the other ripeness, the taste ripeness, was not really happening because the weather had changed and it was a lot cooler than we expected and things like that. So we just needed to wait a lot longer for it to happen. And then in the cellar, in the winery, we had to work the wines a little bit different because we found that they were a lot more delicate than the previous vintage, the 10. And then, of course, we didn't have the 12 to look at because it was still 2011, but it's quite different than the 12, where the wines were just so bold on their own and we didn't have to do a whole lot. So it was a very delicate vintage for Cabernet Sauvignon in the Napa Valley, and it was a really late vintage and difficult to get exactly what you wanted that year. So we had to rely even more on blending to get the final effect on the wine. And what we found in the end too was usually these wines, after a year in the bottle, they're pretty much ready to go. They taste excellent and they have everything that we're looking for in those wines after 12 months in the bottle. But in 2011, because of this vintage challenges that we had, it turned out to be more kind of a French style wine. And I remember when I worked in France that the people would always say, you Americans are kind of crazy because you drink your wines really young. In Bordeaux, we have to wait at least 7 years before we even think of tasting a wine. And so I remember that in making this 2011 wine, and we actually decided to pull it off the shelves and just put it in the library for a while and just kind of let it continue to age in the bottle. And it'll do so because it's got the cork, and the cork allows it to continue to breathe. There's micro amounts of oxygen that go in there. They continue to work the wine and let it evolve and to become something else. So we did that, and we opened it up a couple of years ago and decided, wow, that wine has really changed over the course of the time that it's been in bottle. So to give you a comparison, Cabernet Sauvignon, Cabernet Franc, they both have these qualities which can be kind of more on the herbaceous side or on the floral side when they're not perfectly ripe. And that's one of the things that happens in France is they don't have the luxury of having the weather that we have here that I mentioned. We have pretty warm, sunny weather during the course of ripening here in Napa. And in Bordeaux, they're kind of fighting the opposite. It's rainy most of the time. Most of the years for them when they're harvesting grapes, it's raining. It's really difficult for them to get to ripeness. And so that's one of the reasons they advise that you got to wait for the wine to basically evolve in the bottle before you start drinking it. And so that's because Cabernets, Cabernet varietals, and even Sauvignon Blanc, which is the white grape from Bordeaux, can exhibit kind of these vegetal herbal characters that aren't necessarily pleasant when the wine is young, but they turn into something else as the wine ages, and it becomes turns more into like cassis or licorice and things like that as the wine gets older, and it becomes a more pleasant olfactory experience. And so I think that's kind of what happened a little bit with the 2011s here in Napa, and I've tasted a few from other producers recently, and everybody is pretty shocked at how much the wines have changed and how good they have become over time, how much better they are now than when they first came out. And I think ours is no different. So I think for those of you lucky enough to have this wine now, and by the way, if you don't have it yet, we are going to do another tasting in a couple of weeks to allow people that want to help us out and participate in the SIP program to order the wines and have the wines. And we can taste them again together at that point. But in the meantime, though, you enjoy whatever it is you're enjoying. Even if it's not a Mira wine, that's okay. When you get this wine, you look at it. The first thing that's surprising is the color. And this is a wine that's 2011, so it was bottled in 13, and it's been in bottle almost 7 years. And the color is still really young and vibrant. There's no hint of browning, or it doesn't have any kind of brick tones to it, which is one of the indicators of a wine that's starting to oxidize and age. So it still looks really, really young, when you look at it. And the color's still pretty deep and dark, and in spite of the fact that we didn't necessarily get to the maturity that we were hoping for, we're still able to extract plenty of color into the wine. Then when you smell it, it's got these really classic Cabernet characters. You pick up a little bit of the oak, a little bit of the barrel, and I didn't use a whole lot of new oak on this. And oak has a tendency to hide a lot of stuff. If you use a lot of it, you smell mainly the oak, and so you don't get some of the other underlying characteristics that are in there. But for me, what was important, as always, is to showcase the things that are on the label. The varietal, even if this has a little bit of Merlot and Cabernet Franc, is okay. The vintage and where it comes from. And so the 2011 vintage, you can use techniques like the French started to do, where you concentrate the liquid through machines to get more flavor into it and make the wine something that's maybe not typical of the vintage. I wanted to maintain the purity of the vintage because it's important to me that my wines are pure, and to show what actually happened that year. So when you get a chance to maybe join us and do a vertical tasting of our Cabernets, you'll see, the different effects of the vintage on the same wine year after year, which I think is part of the fun of making wine. So the smell, it's got a, this classic smell that I was describing with a little bit of oak. It's got a little bit of this licorice, a little bit of violets, and more important than the aromas themselves, because everybody's got their own idea of how things smell. For me, is what is the intensity of the aromas? Is there a lot of aroma? Is there very little aroma? And to me, for a wine that's this old, it's got a lot of aroma, and it's a pretty complex sensory profile in your nose. Besides those different things that I'm smelling, there's other stuff in there that I can't quite put my finger on what's there, but it's definitely there. It's definitely aromatic. Then when you taste it, you find that it's a gentler Cabernet than other vintages, and if you compare it to the 10 that came before it or the 12 that came after it, it's a much more elegant style Cabernet than you would get from those other vintages. Those other vintages are much more powerful, and they had much more going on. And keep in mind that 12 was the first of the drought years. So when we have drought years, you have much more powerful wine because the grapes are that much more concentrated because of the lack of water. But it's a very delicious wine to taste. I mean, I'm really impressed with this wine, I would say. It's much more difficult to make a wine in a tough year than in a good year, of course. In a good year, the wine basically makes itself. And so I'm really impressed that almost 10 years later, the wine is showing the way that it is. I just think it's delicious. It's, not trying to be something that it's not. It's just pure and delicious. So I hope you guys get a chance to taste this at some point, and I'd love to hear what other people have to say about this. So with that in mind, let me take a look at some of the questions. Hopefully we have a few, and we can discuss anything else that comes up. Keep asking the questions, even if I'm reading these. So let's go to the first one. So this is from our friend Mira, who loves Mira. How are properly cellared Mira 09 and 10 cabs drinking this year? How many years do you think your oldest cabs can be held? I have at least one from each year stored in a 55-degree cellar. Well, Mira, I'm glad you asked that question, because I think the Cabernets are built for the long haul, and even this wine that came from a vintage not typical of Napa Valley, I think the 9s and the 10s right now are still tasting pretty phenomenal, and they're going to continue to do so for at least another 10 years. I usually am conservative when I say that the Cabernets that we make are 25 to 30-year lifespan on the Cabernets. And tasting this wine, like I mentioned a minute ago, that's from a quote-unquote weaker vintage, and that it tastes the way it does now after 10 years is a really good indicator for me of how the other vintages that are more powerful are going to do. So I would say, 9s, 10s, 12s, 13s, 14s, easily 15s, easily 30, 35 years. And keep in mind, that you get different things as you age. And so, don't expect the wines to taste young when they're 30 years old. Just expect that the wines continue to evolve, and they start taking on other characteristics that are different from when they were young. All right, so let's see. The next question is from Tom Sherry. Thanks again, Tom. Let's see. We don't have the exact vintage or clone of the wine you're showcasing. Would you please compare the flavor profiles of the 2011 vintage versus the 2013? Also, the differences between the Napa Valley Cabernet, the Yountville Cabernet, and the Schweitzer Cabernet. Okay, so basically, the biggest difference is the quality of the vintage from 11, 12, and 13. So it's interesting that we had a really wet year in 2011 and an atypical harvest in that it rained a good amount of the time that we were hoping to have Cabernet ripening. And so in 2011, which was not normal around here, but then in 2012 and 2013, those were the beginning of the drought years that we had 4 or 5 of them in a row. The 12 was the first one, and the 12 was just much more, especially comparing to the 11, coming off the 11, it was so much more powerful and intense, much more grippy, just had a lot more of everything going for it. And then when we get to the 2013, which is the second consecutive year of drought, and we just had, whereas the 12s to me seemed like they were just these perfect wines, right? And in a lot of ways, I tell people that I find that the 12s were on the boring side because they were so good and so easy to enjoy that they didn't really, they just kind of took over your palate, and it's like, here we are, and look how great it is. Whereas the 13 to me wasn't quite as perfect. The second drought year brought its own challenges with the growing of the grapes, and so we had to work a little bit differently to produce the 13 vintage. And so I find the 13s, the nature of the tannins that are in there on the Cabernets, just to be much more interesting to me than the 12s. The 12s are just perfect, and it's like turning on the Beatles. You're gonna like it, right? The 13 maybe it's more wasn't easy to understand early on, but then eventually it grew on you. And I think the 13s now, and the 13 version of this wine had a little bit of Oakville Cabernet in it, which is kind of put it over the top. So I found the 13s to be among my favorites of those drought year vintages. Just still powerful like the 12, but just a much more interesting wine to me. Just a lot more different things going on with it than the 12, which was just kind of a perfect fruit wine that everybody just went crazy over because the 11 was so tough. Then to answer your other question about what is the difference between the Yountville, the Napa Valley, and the Schweitzer, well, the Yountville and the Schweitzer, both of those come from single vineyards, and they're 100% Cabernet. And so the Schweitzer vineyard is a vineyard that's located on the east side of the valley in the Sags Leap district, and it's 43 acres of perfection for growing Cabernet. So that's a vineyard that's been around since the late 1880s. So it's one of the oldest continuous vineyard sites in Napa. The fruit that's on there now is about 25 years old, so nothing that's 100 years old. But the family that owns it is the Schweitzer family, and they've owned and operated it since the 50s. The son is still out there doing the majority of the work, and it's just one of those areas that produces this really fantastic Cabernet that's one of the top spots in the world to grow Cabernet, which is the reason that I was really excited to make that our flagship Cabernet. But we can talk more about that when we taste the Schweitzer here in a couple of weeks, 10 days. The Yountville Cabernet, funny enough, is as the name implies, it comes from the Yountville AVA, which is where our winery is. And Stag's Leap is actually in the town of Yountville, but it's its own AVA. And so an AVA, the American Viticultural Area, we have about 15 of those in Napa. So there's the general Appalachian Napa Valley. Then within that, because there's so many unique areas within the valley and such a variation within the valley, the government has recognized that there's these other sub areas within the valley that are just unique and different from one from another. So, so even though all of these fall into the Napa Valley, we have Yountville, we have Stag's Leap, we have Carneros, we have Oakville, among others, right? We have a lot, like I said, 14 or 15. And so the Yountville appellation is basically adjacent to Stag's Leap. So Stag's Leap is an area that's more on the east side of the valley at the base of the Vaca mountain range. And then once you start getting into the flat part of the valley and going over to the west side of the valley, that becomes the Yountville appellation in that general area. And so interestingly enough, the Yountville vineyard for this Cabernet is directly across the valley from the Schweitzer vineyard, which is really interesting. You know, you get two totally different characteristics in the wine. One, the soil is different, but also the exposure is different. So the Yountville Cabernet being on the west side gets primarily morning sun. So when it gets late in the day, it starts getting the shadow effect from the Mayacamas Mountains on the west side. And while the Schweitzer vineyard benefits from a lot of cool weather at night, just like the Yountville one, but it benefits from the afternoon sun that it gets. And so it produces on these volcanic soils that it's on, it's pretty unique soils that it's on, a much different interpretation of Cabernet. So usually the Schweitzer Cabernet is a lot more concentrated and just a bigger wine, whereas the Yountville Cabernet is a little bit more juicy and shows more typicity of the Cabernet varietal than that. And then the Napa Valley Cabernet is more of a blend. So it's the greatest hits of the Napa Valley. So it encompasses these different Cabernets from these different sub-appellations in Napa, but also incorporates a little bit of Merlot and a little bit of Cabernet Franc. So meant to be more kind of a classic style Napa Cabernet versus a single vineyard, single varietal. All right, let's see what else we got. Let's see. From Kim Bell, how many employees do you have during harvest and throughout the winemaking process? Do you bottle in-house? All right, so most of the year, this time of the year, there's 4 of us total in the winery. So we have a person responsible for hospitality. We have Bear, who's the proprietor. We have me, who's the winemaker, and I have an assistant winemaker. And for the most part, we can get through the year just with the 4 of us. Occasionally, when we have a lot of work to do, like we did last month, trying to catch up with the 2018 wine work and the new 2019 wine work, we'll bring in somebody to help us out for a couple of weeks. But for the most part, it's just the 4 of us doing everything here. And then during the harvest time, this year, we didn't do it last year, but this year we'll probably bring on one person to help us through harvest. We designed the winery in a way that to be as efficient as we can with minimal people, because labor is an issue here. It's hard to get people to hire to work. There's just not that many people available. And so one of the important things to me in designing the winery was to design it in a way that very few people can do the majority of the work, using technology to help us in the processing, but not allowing the technology to make the wine is basically what I was looking for. All right, so then from Michelle File, how many days do you wait from the time that the grapes are initially put into the tanks or cylinders until you start tasting in order to begin making adjustments? So that whole process, Michelle, let me finish the other part of Kim's question. Do we bottle in-house? Yes, we bottle in-house. There are companies in Napa. We don't have a bottling line of our own, but there are companies in Napa that have bottling lines on trucks, and most of the small wineries, such as ourselves, use these mobile bottlers to come to our winery. We have a time set up with them, and we identify the wines and the quantities we're going to bottle, and they show up with the truck 1 or 2 days before, set everything up. We'll bottle in a couple days, and then they'll go. And then we'll send out our bottled wine to the warehouse for storage. So that's pretty typical here in Napa, and in a lot of places that people are using the mobile lines. All right, so back to Michelle's question is, how many days do you wait from the time that the grapes are in the tanks until you start tasting in order to begin making adjustments? So basically the tasting has been happening since before the grapes even arrived at the winery. So in order to make the harvest decision, I'm out there tasting the grapes and trying to get a sense for what the grapes have that year and how I'm going to extract what's in there in the winery. So that all starts, weeks in advance when the grapes start changing color and we start getting enough sugar in the grapes that they're bearable to taste. I'm tasting the grapes several times a week try to determine harvest dates and to see what's going on with those. When the grapes come into the winery and we process them and put them in the tanks, I start tasting right then and there, because as I described earlier, on the red wines, the juice is still pretty clear there then, and so I want to have an impression of what the juice is like on its own before it's gotten a chance to extract anything out of the grapes, and then start doing that 3 or 4 times a day after every operation that we do, before and after and even during the operations, these extractions that I was describing. And also at the same time, I'm waiting for analysis from the lab to see what the vintage looks like in terms of the chemistry, in terms of the sugars and the acids and the pH and stuff like that, to see if there's anything I need to do differently because all of a sudden there's this much sugar, or the acids are much different this year than they were last year, or things like that. So, there's taste, and then there's also kind of backing it up with analysis that takes a couple of days to have. So that's one of the reasons that the 4-day cold soak at least is important, because it gives you enough time to get all your information together to start really honing in on your fermentation regime for that wine. All right, so the next one is from Tom Sherry. One more question. We've been to the new Mira winery facility several times, and we've never seen the room that Gustavo has been in. Where is he? This is the secret room, but it's pretty close to where you tasted the wine. So this is kind of like the do everything room. It's my lab, but it's also kind of doubles as our office. So when you come in and you have the tasting room, there's a hallway to the left, and just as you first enter the hallway, this is the room on the left hand side. So as you're coming up to go through the main door, there's windows on the left hand side of that main door, a big window, and that's basically where this room is. So I use this for technical stuff primarily. It's a big table that I can write on and wipe off with a vis-a-vis, which is one of my favorite things to do. And also, if I need to do a more technical tasting with somebody, or if I'm blending, I've got all my tools for blending there. And then I got like my little lab set up over here, my pH meter, a microscope, a digital scale, and a few other fun toys to play with there. So let's see if there's any other questions there. Otherwise, Tom, we'll make sure the next time you come, you get to see this room. All right. Anyway, well, listen, this one ran a little bit longer, but I'm happy that everybody was able to join me. And I look forward to tasting these wines again. Hopefully some of you get the chance to get these through the SIP program. And we can go through and have a bigger discussion and more questions, hopefully. And hopefully, this raised more questions than got answered, because, the fun thing about wine is the more you know, I think the more that you appreciate it. So I do appreciate you guys all joining me, and I hope you have an excellent weekend. And don't forget, we got this concert tomorrow, miranapa.com/concerts, with our good friend Philip Claypool. And it's a good opportunity to drink a little bit of wine. For those of us in Northern California, we're going to be rained out tomorrow, so we'll be forced to be in the house even more so, drinking wine and hopefully eating something delicious. So thanks again, and I look forward to having another tasting here with everybody really soon. Take care, everybody.